Stand up. Now. The classroom went dead quiet. 28 students froze in their seats as Mrs. Evelyn Harper's voice cracked like a ruler against a desk. Her grip tightened around the attendance clipboard, knuckles whitening as she stared at the boy in the third row. "Did you not hear me, Marcus?" she snapped. "I said stand up." Marcus Reed, 10 years old, rose slowly from his chair. He was small for his age, skinny arms, a sweater 2 sizes too big. His eyes stayed on the floor, not out of defiance, but fear. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. A few kids snickered. Mrs. Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think it's funny to disrespect authority?" she said loudly, making sure every student could hear. "Rolling your eyes, mumbling under your breath?" "I wasn't," Marcus started. "That's enough," she cut in sharply. "I am tired of your attitude." Her voice carried something else now, not just irritation. Certainty. The kind that didn't need proof. "I asked you a simple question, and instead of answering like a respectful young man, you chose to be rude." "I didn't mean to," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "I just—" "Silence." The word landed hard. A girl in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Another boy stared straight ahead, pretending not to see anything. Everyone knew this feeling, the moment when the room decided who the villain was. Mrs. Harper walked toward Marcus's desk, heels clicking against the linoleum. "You've been a problem since September, talking back, not following instructions, always something." "That's not true," Marcus whispered. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Marcus swallowed. His hands shook at his sides. "I said, that's not true, ma'am." The room inhaled collectively. Mrs. Harper stiffened as if struck. "There it is," she said, turning to the class. "You all hear that? Disrespect." A boy in the back muttered, "He's always like that." Another kid laughed. Marcus's face burned. "I wasn't trying to be rude. I just didn't understand the question." Mrs. Harper scoffed. "You didn't understand," she repeated. "Funny how that excuse only comes from you." She turned back to her desk, scribbling something furiously on a yellow slip. "Go to the hallway and take this to the principal's office." She slapped the paper onto Marcus's desk. Marcus stared at it. A disciplinary referral. His chest tightened. "Please," he said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Harper's jaw clenched. "Do not argue with me again," she snapped. "You are already on thin ice. I just— now." Her voice echoed off the walls. Marcus flinched. Slowly, he picked up the slip and walked toward the door. His classmates avoided his eyes. A few whispered. One boy smirked. As Marcus stepped into the hallway, the door shut behind him with a dull, final click. He stood there alone. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and old books. His reflection stared back at him from the glass trophy case, wide-eyed, scared, confused. He hadn't rolled his eyes. He hadn't talked back. He hadn't been disrespectful. He'd just been scared to answer wrong. Marcus leaned against the wall, clutching the yellow slip so tightly it crumpled. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Harper exhaled sharply, straightening her cardigan. "Now," she said briskly, as if nothing had happened, but her hands were shaking. She didn't notice, or maybe she didn't want to. 10 minutes later, the intercom crackled. "Mrs. Harper, please send Marcus Reed to the office." She nodded once. "Already on his way." Out in the hallway, Marcus wiped his eyes quickly as he walked toward the principal's office. He'd been here before, too many times. Each visit felt the same, like standing trial for a crime no one bothered to explain. As he reached the door, he heard voices inside. Low, serious. The principal, a counselor, and someone else. He hesitated, then knocked. "Come in," a man's voice said. Marcus stepped in, heart pounding. The principal didn't smile. "Marcus, we need to talk about your behavior." Marcus stared at the floor. "Yes, sir." Back in the classroom, Mrs. Harper resumed writing on the board. But something nagged at her, a flicker of doubt. She brushed it away. She had 20 years of experience. She knew disrespect when she saw it. Didn't she? What Mrs. Harper didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that this moment would follow her for the rest of her life, that the boy she just sent away would grow up carrying this day like a scar, and that years later, when she finally learned the truth about what really happened in that classroom, it would break her.
The principal's office smelled like old carpet and lemon disinfectant. Marcus noticed that first, because when you're scared, your brain clings to small things. He stood in front of the desk, feet together like he'd been taught at home, hands clasped so tight his fingers ached. The yellow referral slip lay open on the desk between him and Principal Donnelly, the words "disrespectful conduct" circled in thick red ink. Across the room, the school counselor, Mrs. Klein, sat with her notepad already open. She didn't look at Marcus right away. She looked at the paper. That hurt more than the yelling. "Marcus," Principal Donnelly said, folding his hands. His voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy. "This isn't the first time we've had this conversation." Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." "You were sent here for talking back to your teacher." Marcus swallowed. His throat felt dry, like he'd been running, even though he hadn't moved all day. "I didn't talk back," he said quietly. "I just said I didn't understand." Mrs. Klein finally looked up. "That's not what Mrs. Harper wrote," she said, tapping the paper. "She says you were argumentative and disrespectful." Marcus's shoulders sagged. "I didn't get asked again," he said. "She just got mad." The principal leaned back slightly. "Marcus, when an adult gives you an instruction, you follow it, even if you don't like it, even if you're confused." "I wasn't trying to be bad," Marcus said, his voice cracking despite his effort to stay strong. "I just didn't want to say the wrong thing." Silence filled the room. Mrs. Klein exchanged a glance with the principal. "How often do you feel confused in class?" she asked. Marcus hesitated. "All the time," he admitted. "But when I ask questions, people laugh." That part wasn't written on any slip. Principal Donnelly sighed. "Marcus, teachers have a lot to manage. They can't stop the lesson every time one student doesn't understand." "I know," Marcus said quickly. "I'll try harder." That was his answer to everything. Try harder, be quieter, don't make trouble, don't stand out. Mrs. Klein wrote something down. "Do you have trouble focusing? At home, too?" Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am, just when people are watching." She paused, pen hovering. "Watching how?" Marcus shrugged, eyes fixed on his shoes. "Like they're waiting for me to mess up." The principal cleared his throat. "Marcus, you need to understand something. Disrespect is a serious issue. It leads to bigger problems if it's not corrected early." Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." "We're assigning you lunch detention for the rest of the week, and this will go on your behavioral record." Marcus's chest tightened. "Please," he said softly. "My mom, she already worries." Mrs. Klein's expression softened for just a second. "Your mother will be notified," she said gently, "but this is about helping you succeed." Marcus wanted to ask how punishment helped. He didn't. He had learned by now which questions made things worse. "You may go back to class," Principal Donnelly said, "but I expect better choices." "Yes, sir." Marcus turned and walked out, his legs feeling heavier with every step. Back in Mrs. Harper's classroom, the lesson continued as if nothing had happened. She was writing vocabulary words on the board when Marcus returned, eyes red, face carefully blank. She didn't acknowledge him, not with a glance, not with a word.
Marcus slid back into his seat quietly. A boy nearby leaned over and whispered, "You always get in trouble." Marcus stared straight ahead. At lunch, he sat alone at the long detention table while the rest of the class poured into the cafeteria laughing and shouting. A monitor handed him a cheese sandwich in a plastic wrapper. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't ever hungry at school. That evening, Marcus's mother, Denise Reed, stood at the kitchen sink reading the notice the school had sent home. Her jaw tightened. "Disrespectful?" she repeated, disbelief sharp in her voice. "That don't sound like you." Marcus sat at the small table, backpack at his feet. "I tried to explain, but they didn't listen." Denise turned, looking at her son. Marcus had always been quiet, thoughtful, the kind of boy who apologized even when someone else bumped into him. She saw the tiredness in his eyes, the kind a 10-year-old shouldn't have. "I'll talk to them," she said. Marcus shook his head quickly. "No, Mama, please don't." "Why not?" "Because then they'll really think I'm bad. They'll say I'm causing problems." Denise's heart sank. She knew that fear. She had lived it. The next day, Mrs. Harper watched Marcus more closely than before. Every movement, every breath, every glance. When he shifted in his seat, she frowned. When he whispered a question to himself, she stiffened. By Friday, Marcus barely spoke at all, and Mrs. Harper mistook his silence for improvement. This, she thought, watching him sit rigid and still, is what discipline looks like. At the end of the week, she filled out another report. "Behavior improving," she wrote. She didn't notice that Marcus had stopped raising his hand entirely. She didn't notice that he flinched whenever she called his name. She didn't notice the way he stayed behind at class sometimes, pretending to tie his shoes just to avoid the hallway. And she didn't notice, because no one had taught her to look, that Marcus had started to believe what they said about him, that he was trouble, that he was wrong, that speaking up only made things worse. Years would pass before Mrs. Harper thought about Marcus Reed again. Long after the yellow slips faded, long after the desks were replaced, long after Marcus left that school behind. But the lesson he learned that year, it stayed with him. And one day, when Mrs. Harper finally understood what really happened in her classroom, it would come back to her with a force she never expected.
Years passed. Not gently, not evenly. They passed the way years do for kids who learn early that the world is watching them, waiting. Marcus Reed learned how to disappear in plain sight. By middle school, he had perfected the art of being invisible. He sat in the back, kept his eyes down, finished his work early, and never, ever raised his hand unless he was called on directly. Teachers praised him for being well-behaved, quiet, mature for his age. None of them asked why a 12-year-old flinched when spoken to suddenly. None of them asked why his essays were brilliant but always unfinished, as if he stopped himself just before saying too much. At home, Denise noticed the changes. "You used to love telling me about school," she said one night while folding laundry. "Now I gotta pull it out of you." Marcus shrugged, eyes on his phone. "Nothing to tell." "That ain't true," she said softly. "Something happened." Marcus hesitated. A long time ago, he might have told her everything, but now he didn't trust his own version of events. "They just don't like questions. Teachers." Denise stopped folding. "Who told you that?" "No one," he replied quickly. "I just know." High school came with new buildings, new faces, and the same unspoken rules. Marcus excelled academically. Math came easily. History fascinated him, especially the parts that weren't in the textbook margins. He read about civil rights leaders late at night, about court cases and speeches in the long road toward justice. But in class, he stayed quiet. When classmates argued loudly or challenged teachers, Marcus stayed still, heart pounding, waiting for the fallout. Sometimes he watched white students say far worse things than he ever had. Sarcastic remarks, open defiance, only to be met with chuckles or mild warnings. "That's just kids being kids," teachers would say. Marcus absorbed that too. By senior year, his guidance counselor praised his discipline.
"You've got a good head on your shoulders," she said. "Colleges love students who know how to follow rules." Marcus smiled politely. He wondered when following rules had replaced learning. He left for college on a partial scholarship, his mother hugging him tight at the bus station. "Speak up," she whispered into his ear. "Don't let nobody silence you." Marcus nodded, but the silence was already stitched into him. College was different, and the same. Professors encouraged debate, discussions were graded, participation mattered. Marcus sat with thoughts burning behind his ribs, ideas clawing for air. But every time he opened his mouth, he heard echoes. Disrespectful, argumentative, stay in your place. So he learned another trick. He wrote. Late at night, Marcus poured himself into essays and journals no one else would read. He wrote about classrooms that felt like courtrooms, about children punished for tone instead of intent, about how fear learned young doesn't fade, it mutates. One professor noticed, Dr. Alan Pierce, a graying sociology instructor with tired eyes and a patient voice. After returning a paper with a bold A+, he asked Marcus to stay after class. "This is powerful," Dr. Pierce said, tapping the pages. "Why don't you speak like this in class?" Marcus stared at the desk. "I don't want to cause problems." Dr. Pierce studied him. "Who taught you that truth causes trouble?" Marcus didn't answer, because he didn't know how to explain something that happened when he was 10 years old, something everyone else had already forgotten. Years later, Mrs. Harper sat at her kitchen table, grading papers. She had been teaching for almost 30 years now. Her hair was grayer, her voice softer, her patience thinner than she liked to admit. Education had changed. The district had changed. Students had changed. Or so she told herself. That afternoon, the school required all staff to attend a professional development workshop on implicit bias in classroom discipline. Mrs. Harper arrived skeptical. "I treat all my students the same," she muttered to a colleague as they took their seats. The presenter, a calm black woman with glasses and a steady voice, began with data, statistics about suspension rates, referral disparities, words like tone policing, adultification, implicit bias. Mrs. Harper crossed her arms. Then the presenter read a scenario. A student asks for clarification during a lesson. The teacher perceives it as backtalk. The student is disciplined. Something shifted. The presenter continued. Research shows black boys are more likely to be punished for subjective behaviors like disrespect than their peers. Mrs. Harper felt a tightening in her chest she couldn't explain. The presenter asked the room to reflect. Think of a student from early in your career, one you labeled as difficult. Ask yourself, what else could have been happening? A face rose uninvited in Mrs. Harper's mind. A small boy, tight shoulders, careful eyes. Marcus. She hadn't thought of him in years. The workshop ended, but the discomfort didn't. That night, Mrs. Harper pulled out an old storage box from her closet. Inside were lesson plans, photos, and outdated files she never threw away. She flipped through yellowed class lists. There it was, Marcus Reed. She remembered him as quiet, withdrawn, improved after discipline. But suddenly that memory felt incomplete. She searched her district email archive the next day. It took effort, files buried, systems outdated, but eventually she found it. The referral. Disrespectful conduct. Her own handwriting stared back at her. She read it slowly. He questioned instructions, tone inappropriate, challenged authority. Mrs. Harper leaned back in her chair. She tried, honestly, to remember the moment. Had he raised his voice? Had he rolled his eyes? Had he been defiant? Or had he simply been confused? Her stomach sank. She realized something chilling. She couldn't remember his tone at all, only that she'd felt challenged, threatened, embarrassed, and she'd reacted. The workshop's words echoed in her mind. Impact matters more than intent. For the first time in decades, Mrs. Harper wondered, what had I taught that boy that day? Not about grammar, not about respect, but about silence. And as that realization settled over her like a weight, she understood something else too. Whatever she had done to that boy, he had carried it far longer than she ever would.
Mrs. Harper didn't sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, the quiet of her house louder than any classroom had ever been. The ticking clock on her nightstand felt accusatory, each second pulling her further into memories she had neatly packed away decades ago. Marcus Reed. The name echoed with an unfamiliar weight. She had taught thousands of students. Faces blurred over time, names faded. But now this one pressed forward, sharp and insistent, like it refused to be forgotten any longer. The next morning, Mrs. Harper arrived at school early, earlier than usual. The halls were still empty, lockers lining the walls like silent witnesses. She unlocked her classroom and sat at her desk without turning on the lights. For the first time in years, she questioned her certainty. She had always believed she was fair, firm but fair. That was her reputation. Parents trusted her, administrators praised her classroom management. She had been the teacher younger staff were told to emulate. But fairness, she was beginning to realize, could look very different depending on who was standing in front of you. During her planning period, she pulled out an old notebook, one she used to keep reflections in during her early teaching years. She hadn't opened it in a long time. Flipping through the pages, she found entries about classroom control, authority, and respect. One line stopped her cold. If you don't set boundaries early, you lose them forever. She remembered how strongly she believed that, how fear had masqueraded as discipline, how questioning felt like a threat instead of curiosity. The bell rang, jolting her back to the present. Students flooded in, loud and restless. Mrs. Harper stood automatically, greeting them, but her voice felt different in her ears, less certain. That afternoon, an email arrived from the district. Subject: Alumni Career Spotlight, Guest Speaker. The name beneath it made her breath catch. Marcus Reed, Esquire. Public Defender, Civil Rights Advocate. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the attachment. Marcus Reed would be returning to the district next week to speak to high school students about justice, education, and advocacy. The photo showed a tall black man in a suit, eyes steady, expression calm but guarded. She stared at his face, searching for the boy she once knew. She saw it now, in the eyes. A flicker of restraint, a practiced stillness. Mrs. Harper closed her laptop slowly. Her heart pounded, not with excitement, but dread. Because suddenly, the story wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a voice, and it was coming back. Marcus Reed stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, adjusting his tie. At 32, he had learned how to wear authority carefully, never too loud, never too soft. He knew how quickly perception could shift. The invitation to speak at his old school district had stirred something uncomfortable. He almost said no. But then he remembered the kids who looked like him, kids who still sat silently in classrooms, swallowing questions whole. So he said yes. As he drove toward the school the following week, memories surfaced uninvited. The hallway smell, the squeak of sneakers, the way his stomach used to knot before certain classes. He told himself it was different now. He was in control. Still, when he pulled into the parking lot and saw the building, something inside him tightened. Inside the faculty office, Mrs. Harper sat stiffly as the principal chatted cheerfully. "You must be proud," the principal said. "One of your former students doing so well." Mrs. Harper forced a smile. "Yes," she replied quietly. "Very." When Marcus entered the room, conversation paused. He shook hands, polite and composed. When his eyes met Mrs. Harper's, there was no recognition, just professional courtesy. And that hurt more than she expected. She had lived with that moment for years. For him, it had been one of many. The assembly was held in the gym. Hundreds of students sat cross-legged on the floor or slouched in bleachers, phones confiscated for the hour.
Marcus stepped up to the microphone. He didn't start with his accolades, he started with a story. "When I was 10, he said, voice steady, I learned that asking questions could be dangerous. The room grew quiet. He spoke about classrooms that confused compliance with respect, about how children internalize punishment, about how silence becomes survival. Mrs. Harper sat frozen in her chair. Every word landed like a mirror. Marcus didn't name her. He didn't need to. When the applause came, it was thunderous. Students lined up afterwards to talk to him, questions spilling out, hands raised eagerly. Mrs. Harper watched from a distance. She wanted to approach him, but fear, old and familiar, held her back. The same fear that had once made her assert authority instead of listening. Later that afternoon, she found him alone in the hallway, gathering his things. "Marcus," she said softly. He turned. "Yes?" "I'm Mrs. Harper." Something flickered in his expression. Recognition. Not warm, not angry, just awareness. "Oh," he said. "Hello." They stood there, years pressing between them. "I wanted to say—" Then she stopped. Words failed her. Apologies felt too small, explanations too hollow. Marcus watched her carefully. "I've been doing a lot of reflecting lately," she tried again, "about my teaching, about the impact we have." He nodded once. "Impact lasts," he said simply. She swallowed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he said, "I know." Not, "It's okay," not, "I forgive you," just acknowledgement. And that, somehow, was heavier. As he walked away, Mrs. Harper felt something break open inside her. She understood now. The punishment hadn't ended when the referral was written. It had followed him, shaped him, and she had never once thought to look back. That evening, Mrs. Harper sat at her desk long after students had gone home. She stared at the empty chairs, imagining the children who once filled them. How many Marcus Reeds had passed through her room? How many questions had she silenced? She picked up a pen and began to write. Not lesson plans, not notes for administrators, but a letter. Not to defend herself, not to justify, to listen. Because for the first time in her career, she realized the truth she had missed. Disrespect was never the problem. Fear was. And now, it was her turn to face it.
The fallout didn't come all at once. It came in waves. Quiet at first, subtle, almost polite. Mrs. Harper noticed it the very next morning when she walked into the teacher's lounge. Conversations softened when she entered. A few colleagues smiled too quickly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Someone had shared Marcus Reed's speech online. By lunchtime, it had thousands of views. By the end of the school day, it was everywhere. Parents forwarded it in group chats. Alumni commented with stories of their own. Former students, now grown, began speaking up, not angrily at first, but honestly. That happened to me too. I remember being sent out of class for asking why. I learned early to stay quiet. Mrs. Harper sat at her desk, refreshing her email inbox like it might explain how the ground beneath her had shifted so suddenly. She had spent decades building a reputation. Now it was unraveling in real time. An email from the principal arrived just before dismissal. Subject, "Please see me after school." Her stomach tightened. When she entered his office, he gestured for her to sit. His expression wasn't angry. That somehow made it worse. "Eleanor," he began gently, "we need to talk." She nodded. "I assumed we would." He folded his hands. "The district is receiving calls. Parents want answers. They're asking how disciplinary policies were enforced 10, 15, 20 years ago." She felt heat rise to her face. "I followed protocol." "I know," he said carefully, "but protocol isn't the same as justice."
The words stung. "We're not accusing you of wrongdoing, but we are reviewing past disciplinary records, especially patterns." Patterns. Mrs. Harper's throat tightened. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said quietly. "I believe that," the principal replied, "but intent doesn't erase impact." She left his office feeling smaller than she had in years. That night, she turned on the television and froze. Marcus Reed sat across from a news anchor, calm and composed. "What made you want to speak out now?" the anchor asked. Marcus didn't hesitate, because silence teaches children that their voices don't matter, and when that silence falls disproportionately on black boys, we need to ask why. Mrs. Harper watched, hands clasped in her lap. He wasn't attacking her, he was telling the truth, and that truth was bigger than one classroom. The next day, students looked at her differently, some with curiosity, some with caution, a few with open defiance. During third period, a boy raised his hand. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why do some kids get punished more for the same stuff?" he asked. The room went quiet. This time, Mrs. Harper didn't respond with authority. She responded with honesty. "That's a fair question, and one adults are still learning how to answer." The boy nodded, surprised. After class, a young black girl lingered by her desk. "My brother says you're the teacher from the video," she said. Mrs. Harper braced herself. "Yes." The girl studied her. "Are you mad he spoke up?" Mrs. Harper shook her head. "No." "Good," she said simply, "because I'm tired of being scared to ask things." Something cracked inside Mrs. Harper's chest. That evening, she attended a community forum the district hastily organized. Parents packed the auditorium. Emotions ran high. Some demanded accountability. Others demanded reform. A few demanded resignations. Mrs. Harper sat in the front row, hands folded, listening. When it was time for public comments, she stood. The room quieted. "I taught in this district for 34 years. I believed structure kept children safe. I believed firmness was fairness." She paused, her voice trembling. "I now understand that I was wrong about some things, and I'm sorry." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I cannot undo the harm, but I can acknowledge it, and I can listen." Someone shouted, "Why now?" She didn't flinch. "Because it took me too long to realize that being respected as a teacher doesn't mean you never question yourself." Silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, applause. Not thunderous, not unanimous, but real. Across town, Marcus watched the live stream with his mother, Denise Reed. She squeezed his hand. "You did this," she said softly. He shook his head. "We did." The next week brought more change. The district announced mandatory bias training. Discipline policies were revised. A review board was formed. Some teachers resisted. Others welcomed it. Mrs. Harper volunteered for every session, not out of guilt, out of responsibility. One afternoon, she found a letter in her mailbox. It wasn't from the district. It was from Marcus. "I don't know if apologies change the past, but accountability changes the future. Thank you for listening." She held the letter for a long time. The fallout had stripped away her certainty, but in its place, something quieter had emerged. Humility, and a chance, however late, to do better.
The backlash didn't come from where Mrs. Harper expected. It didn't come from angry parents shouting in hallways or students acting out in class. It came quietly, through whispers, emails, and doors that no longer opened as easily as they once had. By the second week after Marcus's speech went viral, the district offices were flooded. Some messages praised the changes, calling them long overdue. Others were furious. "This is political indoctrination. Teachers are being scapegoated. My child shouldn't feel guilty for being white. Mrs. Harper received copies of some of those emails for awareness. Reading them felt like being pulled apart in opposite directions. At school, a veteran teacher cornered her near the copy machine. "I hope you're happy," he said under his breath. "They're turning us into villains." She met his eyes. "No one said villains. We're being asked to reflect." "Reflect?" he scoffed. "I've been teaching longer than that boy's been alive." "So had I," she replied quietly. "That didn't make me right." He walked away, shaking his head. In the parking lot after school, a folded flyer was tucked under her windshield wiper. "Stop cancel culture in our schools. Protect our teachers." Her name wasn't on it, but it didn't need to be. At home, the phone rang late at night. "This is harassment," a voice snapped before she could respond. "My father taught here too. You're throwing good educators under the bus to please activists." Mrs. Harper closed her eyes. "I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. I'm asking us to look at patterns. You're letting them rewrite history." "No," she said steadily. "History is already written. We're just finally reading it." The line went dead. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own storm. At the law firm where he worked, partners congratulated him publicly, then cautioned him privately. "You're brave, but be careful. Not everyone likes mirrors." Online, the comments were brutal. Some praised him as courageous. Others called him divisive, ungrateful, a troublemaker. One message read, "You survived school. Why can't you just move on?" Marcus stared at it longer than he should have, because surviving isn't the same as being seen. At home, his mother worried. "You're carrying a lot," Denise said, watching him pace the living room. "I know," he replied, "but if I stop now, it proves them right." Across town, the district announced a public listening session. No speeches, no microphones, just circles of chairs. Mrs. Harper almost didn't go. She was tired, exposed, afraid of saying the wrong thing, but she went anyway. The room buzzed with tension, teachers on one side, parents and former students on the other. Marcus arrived late, slipping into a chair near the back. When the facilitator invited reflections, silence lingered. Then Mrs. Harper stood. "I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to listen." A father stood across from her. "My son was suspended 3 times for talking back. Each time he was asking why." Mrs. Harper nodded slowly. "I once punished a student for the same thing." Marcus's chest tightened. A woman spoke next, tears in her eyes. "My daughter learned to shrink in your classrooms. She learned that silence was safer." Mrs. Harper's voice broke. "I'm sorry." Some people crossed their arms. Others leaned forward. Then Marcus spoke. "I don't need apologies. I need systems to change so my kids won't have to unlearn the same lessons." Heads nodded. The backlash hadn't disappeared, but something shifted. Not everyone was ready to listen, but enough were. Later that week, Mrs. Harper received another email from the district. Subject: Teaching Assignment Update. Her position for the upcoming semester had changed. She'd no longer teach advanced placement classes. Instead, she'd been assigned to mentor new teachers and help pilot restorative discipline practices. It wasn't a demotion, but it wasn't the role she'd spent decades earning. She sat at her kitchen table, rereading the email. A wave of grief washed over her. Grief for the certainty she'd lost, the authority she'd once carried so effortlessly. Then she remembered Marcus at 12, standing alone, being told his voice was a problem. She replied with one line, "I accept." At school, rumors spread quickly. She got pushed aside. They took her power. Mrs. Harper didn't correct them. She focused on the new teachers, young, earnest, overwhelmed. She shared stories she'd never told before. "I once believed respect meant silence. Now I know it means understanding." Some listened, some resisted, but a few took notes. Meanwhile, Marcus received an invitation to speak at a statewide education conference. He hesitated. "I'm not an educator," he told the organizer. "No," they replied, "you're an expert in the consequences." The night before his talk, Marcus sat with his mother, reading through his notes. "You nervous?" He smiled. "Funny thing is, I was terrified to speak up as a kid. Now people are asking me to." She squeezed his shoulder. "That's how change works. It scares you until it doesn't." Backlash continued. Articles debated whether schools were becoming too soft. Radio hosts mocked restorative justice. But quietly, classrooms changed. Suspensions dropped. Students talked more. Teachers asked different questions. One afternoon, a boy stayed after class in Mrs. Harper's room. "I used to think teachers didn't care. You're different." She smiled gently. "I'm learning." Across the city, Marcus finished his speech to a standing ovation, not because everyone agreed, but because he spoke truth without bitterness. The backlash had taken its toll, but it had also drawn a line, and on one side of that line, silence was no longer acceptable.
The reckoning didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, inside a classroom that smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old books. Mrs. Harper stood at the front of the room, watching a group of student teachers settle into their seats. Some were fresh out of college. Others were changing careers after years in the workforce. All of them carried the same mix of hope and fear she once had. She cleared her throat. "I want to tell you a story," she said. "Not the kind they put in textbooks." They looked up. "It's about a boy named Marcus Reed." A few shifted. They recognized the name. He was 12, smart, curious, restless in the way curious kids often are, and I punished him for something I didn't fully understand. She paused, letting the weight of that sit. I thought I was teaching respect. What I taught him instead was caution, silence, how to make himself smaller. One of the young teachers raised a hand. "Did you know at the time?" Mrs. Harper shook her head. "No, and that's the danger. Harm doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind routine." Across town, Marcus sat in his office staring at an old photo his mother had found while cleaning. It was from his middle school graduation. He stood on the stage, smiling stiffly, certificate in hand. Mrs. Harper stood a few feet behind him, clapping politely. For years, that image had stirred resentment. Now, it stirred something else. Complexity. His phone buzzed. An email from the district. Subject: Invitation to participate in Curriculum Review Committee. He leaned back in his chair. The same system that once punished him was now asking him to help reshape it. He thought of his younger self, angry, confused, unheard. Then he thought of the kids sitting in classrooms right now. He replied, "I'm in." The committee meetings were tense. Educators debated language, parents argued over intent, lawyers worried about liability. Marcus listened more than he spoke at first. Then one afternoon, a teacher said, "We can't account for every student's feelings." Marcus leaned forward. "This isn't about feelings, it's about patterns. When the same groups are punished more often for subjective offenses, that's not coincidence, that's culture." Silence followed. Mrs. Harper watched him from across the table. She recognized the courage it took to speak in that room. After the meeting, she approached him. "Marcus," she said gently, "may I walk with you?" They stepped into the hallway. "I want you to know," she began, "I don't expect forgiveness." He nodded. "I know. But I need to say this face to face. I was wrong, and I'm still unlearning." Marcus studied her. "You know," he said slowly, "for a long time I imagined this conversation ending differently." She smiled faintly. "So did I." "What changed?" he asked. "I listened. Too late, but fully." They stood there, not as teacher and student, but as two people shaped by the same moment in different ways.
Meanwhile, the school prepared for its annual assembly. This time, the theme wasn't achievement, it was voice. Students were invited to share stories about times they felt heard and times they didn't. The auditorium filled with nervous energy. Parents sat beside teachers, administrators hovered near exits. Mrs. Harper sat in the second row. Marcus stood backstage, microphone in hand. He wasn't scheduled to speak, but the principal had asked if he'd say a few words. He hesitated, then agreed. When he stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. I once stood here and believed my silence was safety. Some students shifted uncomfortably. I learned that speaking up had consequences, but so does staying quiet. He scanned the crowd. To the students here today, your questions are not disrespect. Your curiosity is not a threat, and your voice is not a problem to be solved. Applause rose, tentative at first, then stronger. Mrs. Harper felt tears gather. After the assembly, a young black boy approached Marcus. "They say I talk too much," the boy said. Marcus knelt to his level. "Do you ask questions?" The boy nodded. "Then don't stop. Just learn how to make them hear you." Across the room, Mrs. Harper watched that exchange. She thought of the boy Marcus had been. She thought of all the moments she couldn't take back. But she also saw something she hadn't expected: continuity. The past wasn't erased, but it was informing the future. Later that evening, Mrs. Harper sat alone in her classroom, packing away old lesson plans. She pulled out a file she hadn't opened in years: disciplinary records. She paused at Marcus's name: insubordination. She crossed it out with a single line. Then she wrote beside it: curiosity, courage, voice. It wasn't official, but it mattered to her. Across town, Marcus tucked his kids into bed. "Daddy, why do you go to school so much?" He smiled. "Because I want them to be better than the one I went to." She nodded, satisfied. As the lights dimmed across the city, something subtle but real had shifted. Not everything was fixed, but the truth had circled back, demanding to be acknowledged, not ignored. And for the first time, both the boy who was punished and the teacher who punished him stood on the same side of it.
The truth doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a door left ajar, letting in a draft you didn't know you needed. Years passed, not in dramatic leaps, but in the steady accumulation of small changes that rarely make headlines. Classroom policies were rewritten, teacher training expanded. Words like defiance and disrespect were replaced with context and understanding. None of it erased the past, but it reshaped the future. Mrs. Eleanor Harper retired at the end of that school year. No ceremony, no long speech, just a small gathering in the library with coffee, cookies, and former colleagues who spoke politely about her dedication and years of service. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't list accomplishments. She told the truth. "I spent much of my career believing fairness meant treating every child the same," she said softly. "I know now that fairness means listening when a child tells you their world is not the same." Some people nodded, some looked uncomfortable, but no one interrupted. Afterwards, she packed her things slowly. The room looked smaller than she remembered. The chalkboard still bore faint ghosts of old lessons. The desks were scuffed and uneven. The clock still ticked too loudly. Before leaving, she opened her drawer one last time. Inside was a folded piece of paper she'd kept for years. Marcus Reed's apology letter. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was young, careful, earnest. "I'm sorry if I was disrespectful. I didn't mean to be." Her chest tightened. She placed the letter back in the drawer. Then she added something new, a handwritten note of her own. "You were not wrong to ask questions. I was wrong not to hear them." She left it there, not for recognition, not for forgiveness, but because some truths deserve to stay where they began. Across the city, Marcus stood at the podium of a community center gymnasium. The crowd wasn't large, but it was attentive. Parents, teachers,
Teenagers sitting with crossed arms, pretending not to care. Marcus spoke without notes. "When I was 12, he said, I learned that how you're perceived can matter more than what you mean." A murmur rippled through the room. "I learned that silence can feel safer than honesty, and that lesson followed me longer than it should have." He paused. "But I also learned something else, later." He looked at the students. "Systems don't change because they're evil. They change because someone finally tells the truth loud enough that it can't be ignored." A hand went up. A teenage girl. "What if no one listens?" Marcus smiled gently. "Then you keep speaking, and you find allies, and you document, and you outlast the silence." After the talk, a teacher approached him. "I was trained the way Mrs. Harper was," she admitted. "Sometimes I worry I'll make the same mistakes." Marcus nodded. "You will," he said kindly. "What matters is whether you're willing to see them when you do." Later that evening, Marcus drove past his old middle school. The building hadn't changed much. Same brick walls, same chain-link fence, same basketball court with uneven pavement. But something inside him had shifted. For years, that place represented injustice. Now it represented something harder and more honest: growth. At home, his mother sat at the kitchen table folding laundry. She looked up as he walked in. "You spoke well today," she said. I smiled. "You watched?" "Every word," she replied. She hesitated. "You know, when you were punished back then, I wanted to fight everyone. I wanted to pull you out of that school." "I know," Marcus said. "But you didn't," she continued. "You told me you wanted to stay. You said running wouldn't fix it." He laughed softly. "I didn't know what I was talking about." "Yes, you did," she said. "You always did." They sat in comfortable silence. Elsewhere, in another school across town, a young teacher stood at her desk as a student raised his hand. "Yes?" she said. The boy shifted nervously. "Why do we have to do it this way?" A few students snickered. The teacher paused. Old instincts flickered. Then she remembered the training, the stories, the names. "Tell me more," she said. The boy blinked. "Really?" "Yes," she replied. "Really." And just like that, a different lesson began. Not one about obedience, but one about trust. Years later, a scholarship was established in Marcus's name, not because he demanded it, not because he sought recognition, but because a group of former students and educators believed his story deserved to echo. The application prompt was simple: describe a time when you were misunderstood and what you learned from it. Hundreds applied. Some wrote about classrooms, some about homes, some about moments they'd never spoken aloud before. Mrs. Harper read every application, slowly, carefully. She cried more than once. On the day the first recipient was announced, she watched from the back of the auditorium. Marcus stood on stage handing the certificate to a shy student who looked a little too familiar. Before leaving, Mrs. Harper approached him. "I wanted you to know," she said, "I read them all." He smiled. "That doesn't surprise me." They stood together for a moment, watching the crowd disperse. "You know," she said, "I used to think this story was about my failure." Marcus' head shook. "It's about accountability and what we do after." She nodded, and she walked away, feeling lighter than she had in years. Not absolved, but aligned. And somewhere, in a classroom filled with noise and curiosity, a black boy raised his hand, unafraid. This time, someone listened, and that made all the difference.